For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Tabi Shomulikai. Joining me today is Associate Professor of Political Science at Stellenbosch University, Collette Schulz-Herzenberg, and Emeritus Professor of Sociology at the University of Witwatersrand, Roger Southall, here to discuss their co-edited book titled Election 2024 South Africa, Countdown to Coalition. Election 2024 South Africa is the fourth edition in a series of studies on the country's general elections, and the third one you both have edited together. So, Professor Roger, could you share more about the process of putting this edition together? And I understand that you mentioned that it was the most complicated to produce. So, what made it so challenging?
Well, a couple of things, really. Well, first of all, there had been something of a change to the electoral system, allowing for independent voters to stand in this election separate from political parties. So that was one thing. We had to deal with the change to the electoral system. There was also the fact that halfway through our preparations for this, suddenly a new political party pops up, the MK party, which made life more difficult. But when you're doing a book like this, you're trying to put together a good, coherent chapter outline, and we had to think: does MK disappear into different chapters, like the ANC and the IFP or whatever, or does it have a chapter on its own? In the end, we decided to have a chapter on the own, but you have to make these decisions on the run, so to speak, because we have a very tight timetable on producing this book, which is we have a pre-election workshop so that the papers, we know what's coming in the papers roughly, but then of course the papers have to be revised in light of the results of the election. They have to be externally refereed, and then we have to hand copy to the publisher within 6 weeks so that we have a book which is published in time for the public to remember that actually was an election held this year. This one was the most complicated because, for a start, we really did think that the ANC might not get its 50%. We've always thought this might be a possibility in previous elections, but this time around, we thought it might be, in which case we had to prepare for it to be a coalition. And that's going to demand extra consideration in the chapter outline and indeed in the way we wrote the entire introduction, and people were going to write their chapters.
And Professor Collette, in the book, one of the authors, Dick Kotze, discusses the challenges to the IEC's integrity and impartiality. So can you expand more on the IEC's role in the 2024 elections and how it is addressing these challenges to ensure a fair and credible process?
Yes, I think this was possibly the most challenging election that the IEC had to conduct and oversee. It was made complicated by a number of factors. The first was a third ballot. We knew as the elections approached that we would need to be able to vote across 3 ballots and not only 2 as we had previously done. And this complicated things for the IEC from a procedural point of view. They had to get a third ballot printed, they had to distribute it, and they also had to educate the public about what it meant. And of course, time is of the essence when it comes to these sorts of voter education programs, but there wasn't much time to do all of this in. So that was possibly, the first biggest logistical challenge that the IEC faced. On top of that, I think with the emergence of a new political party, Umkhonto we Sizwe, it was clear that to begin with, MK would not necessarily conduct itself in a way that would accept the IEC's decisions. And as the election approached, MK put forward a lot of challenges that really, I think, tested the IEC's integrity and authority. I think the IEC did well in the sense that it dealt with those challenges largely on a procedural level, as legislation would demand. And those challenges went via the courts. And I think all court rulings found in favor of the IEC, which allowed the administration side of the institution to get on with rolling out elections. But even after the elections, MK still challenged the result. They wouldn't necessarily accept the result. I think to date, there isn't a full acceptance of the result of this election. And those remain challenges. But having said all of that, challenges to election results are not new in South Africa, but they've largely come from the much smaller parties. And the IEC has been able to grapple with those shortly after election day through party liaison committees and in environments where conflict dispute can be sorted out quite quickly. But MK launched a very unique set of challenges, I think, for the IEC. And although the institution, I think it can be said that it dealt with it well, and the elections were largely free and fair, I think those challenges haven't necessarily gone away for future elections.
And you analyzed the evolution of political participation by examining voter registration and turnout since the country's first democratic election. Can you expand more on this?
Yes, so there was some expectation that this election might see a turnaround in voter turnout, in that perhaps we would see more people coming to the polls than in previous elections. And there were good reasons to expect that. We knew that the ANC was on the cusp of perhaps losing its majority, and that often, tight margins in elections tend to foster turnout. We also had the introduction of independent candidates, which was an unknown. We didn't know whether, in fact, voters would find this appealing and want to support these individuals. There were more parties, in fact, but in the event and on the day, turnout actually plummeted again. And there were plenty of reasons to expect that to happen too. We knew before the election that the registered numbers of voters had gone up in terms of actual numbers, but as a proportion of our eligible voting age population, it had dropped yet again, and dropped quite considerably. On the day, turnout actually went down, I would say, in its largest proportion decline than we had seen in previous elections, down to around 59% of registered voters from 66 in the 2019 election. But in fact, if we consider a more accurate measure of turnout, which is a global measure, and we look at people who are participating who are eligible to do so, there we see a shocking result of around 41%, which now tells us that 4 in 10 eligible South Africans choose to vote, 6 in 10 choose not to. And this has, I think, really raised a number of big questions and concerns around the quality of the mandate that we are passing over to our governments at each election. Very low levels of turnout tend to undermine representativity and the legitimacy of the outcome. 6 in 10 people have no say about which government runs the country. And I think we need to start asking important questions about why this is the case. South Africa now has one of the lowest turnout rates in the world, in fact.
Talking about the ANC, Professor Roger, how has the party positioned itself to face the electorate against an uncompromising background of economic slowdown and multiple political discontents?
I think it was very significant that the ANC went into this election campaign and it basically said, you are better off than you were 30 years ago. And it wanted to highlight that just about the average person in South Africa is slightly better off than they were in 1994. And they were really building their program around their performance, essentially under Thabo Mbeki, when the economy was performing considerably better than it had subsequently. They weren't prepared to campaign on what's happened in the last 10 years. And in fact, we know very well that Cyril Ramaphosa said been 9 wasted years. They went into this campaign on the back of load shedding. They went into the back of collapse of service delivery in many municipalities. They knew perfectly well that their recent performance has been much below par. Hence the importance of stressing the record over 30 years, trying to make it sound better. So I think that showed an immediate weakness and shows that the ANC is well aware that their appeal as a party is beginning to collapse. And I think they are struggling to find how to restore themselves as an appealing choice to the voter. And the decline in the ANC vote shows very much that the electorate is increasingly disillusioned with the ANC.
I was just thinking it might be quite instructive to point out that the ANC lost considerable support over the last few elections, and millions of voters have actually abandoned the party. Some have gone elsewhere, but the vast majority haven't. And there's been a different dynamic in this election around those dissatisfied ANC voters. The rise of MK provided, if you like, a regional home for a lot of dissatisfied ANC voters who had previously supported the party. And I think, that shift to MK, presumably from a number of dissatisfied ANC voters, really hurt the ANC at this election. It's that movement of vote across from one party to another that brings down your vote share. And we hadn't necessarily seen that in previous elections. So what I'm saying is, although millions of voters have abandoned the ANC, they haven't necessarily crossed to another party. And that has helped the ANC hold a commanding majority in the face of declining turnout for the party. But something changed in this election with the introduction of MK. And this is one of the reasons why we see the national vote share of the party falling to around 40%. So it's really that effect of the PR shift that really pulls the ANC's vote down. I think it's also really important to remember that the draw cards that the ANC had enjoyed in previous election had dissipated in this election. And I speak specifically here referring to Cyril Ramaphosa himself. We knew that in 2019, the ANC's brand was damaged, with the allegations of state capture and corruption having emerged in those recent months before the election. But Cyril Ramaphosa himself was a very popular leader, and he outstripped other opposition leaders by far in terms of popularity. And what was interesting in 2019 was that his popularity was cross-partisan. We know that there are a number of opposition voters who voted for the ANC at national level, presumably to bolster Cyril's reformist agenda. It was seen as a strategic move to help the ANC maintain power in the face of an EFF challenge. And I think by 2024, the support for Ramaphosa himself had dissipated considerably. If you look at trust levels, he had dropped from around 60% to the high 20s. The ANC sat also in the high 20s. These are very low levels of trust. And the ANC wasn't able to go into the 24 election with its key draw card: popular leaders, a record of performance and service delivery, and these incredibly important credentials which the party had carried in previous elections had just simply disappeared by now.
And while we are on the MK party, Professor Roger, what could be the implications for democracy in the party's rise?
Well, I think they are potentially very serious, because we know that the MK entered this election on a program of saying that basically we want to get rid of the Constitution. We don't accept the settlement of 1994. We want to go back to a system, what they term straightforward majority rule, whereby a majority party in Parliament could simply alter the Constitution by a simple majority vote. So in all those basic protections which are built into our Constitution in terms of the Bill of Rights, the primacy of the Constitutional Court as a guarantor of the Constitution, all that would disappear. And in effect, we would go back to what the National Party had before 1994. And so potentially you have, if the MK were to come to power and were to implement this sort of scheme, you would have a massive reversion to a potentially dictatorial situation. And I rather suspect that that is not what South Africans are looking for. Of course, it's a long step for the MK to actually get into that position. We may find that within the progress of this parliament that the MK may actually displace the government of provincial unity in KZN, which does look very fragile, in which case it will have more ability to maintain its support by its ability to distribute patronage, basically. But at the same time, it's running the KZ provincial government would continue its identity as a movement, as MK, as a party of a particular section of the population, in other words, the Zulu-speaking population, which would have some pluses, but also have, I think, a lot of minuses nationally. We have yet to see whether the MK would really have the ability to make itself have a national appeal. And if their draw card is President Zuma, then I'm afraid that is a fairly limited draw card. As we all know, death and taxes are the two eternities we have to grapple with.
Can you elaborate more on the complexity and the key issues that emerged during the formation of the GNU?
I think, before the election, we were thinking, well, what's the ANC going to do? And the great fear in some quarters before the election was that the ANC, if it lost its majority, would form a coalition with the EFF. And you had people like the DA saying this was the so-called doomsday coalition. It would send the economy into a downward spin, etc., etc. Well, the EFF's particular path was skewered by the rise of MK, which took votes away from the EFF. So the EFF did not have sufficient votes to allow the ANC to have a majority. MK was saying we will not form a coalition with the ANC with Cyril Ramaphosa as the president. The ANC was saying we will not dump Cyril Ramaphosa. And at the same time, I think it was quite clear that the Ramaphosa faction in the ANC said, well, the problem is if we do go into a coalition with either of these parties, then we are going to see the economy hit in terms of investment flowing out and so forth. The other thing is the sheer electoral facts. The ANC had 40%, the DA came in with a very strong nearly 22%. And this would form a very clear message that the majority of those who had voted, over 60%, would potentially be seen as backers of the GNU. Go in with any of the other parties and your level of support is much lower. So I think once the GNU, the idea of a link up between the ANC and the DA was on the table, then the issue was for the ANC what to do now. And I think what the ANC wanted to do was to deflect criticism of its going into a coalition with the DA by widening its support base, by bringing in other political parties to give itself wider legitimacy within those who traditionally have supported the ANC and who might query going in with a party which is often referred to in many quarters as simply representing white interests. So I think by the time the election results were in, the options for the ANC had effectively narrowed down to going in with the DA, but then whether it would be possible to bring in other parties as well, which the DA originally did not want, but had to concede. The DA was always recognizing that bringing in other parties would actually lower its leverage within the GNU, but it had to live with it.
And lastly, what do you both hope readers take away after reading this book?
Well, we have to hope, I think anybody in their senses would not want the GNU to fail, in the sense that South Africa desperately needs a government which is respected as working and as functional. We need the GNU, any government, whatever its label, we need a GNU to be able to perform the basic functions of government, to be able to run the economy competently, to be able to deliver services competently, to be able to provide safety to the ordinary people in this country, which is manifestly failing to do at the moment. It needs to clamp down on corruption. Now, at the moment, we've got very mixed performance coming out of the GNU, and we have to hope that it increase its level. The recent movement of a minister who has a lot of questions about her honesty has recently been moved from justice to housing, which has a much larger budget. These are questions which hang over the probity of the ANC within the GNU and raise continuing problems about how well the GNU is going to perform. But I don't really think it's in anybody's interest for this GNU to be a dismal failure, not those who don't have a very narrow political interest.
And perhaps just to add to that, for me, it's really about political parties, it's about participation, and it's about policy. I think the book highlights these three themes And if we start with political parties in South Africa, I think parties need to refocus themselves in terms of what's important to voters. I think there's a real disconnect between what political parties punt and what voters are looking for. I think the ordinary South African is really looking for solutions to address the issues that Roger's highlighted around governance, around delivery, around the capacity of the state, jobs, the economy, etc. But there seems to be a real disconnect in terms of what political parties talk about and prioritize and campaign on. And there seems to be a movement towards identity politics again in South Africa, which is frankly concerning. So I think parties really, in order to create alternative options for voters, to create political homes that are relevant for voters, they need to really rethink what they're talking about, whom they're talking to, and so forth. And this links directly to participation. I think if political parties can become more relevant and speak a language that resonates with ordinary South Africans, addresses the issues that are on the table, then I think we will see a return to the polls amongst the ordinary South African, who's not necessarily disillusioned with democracy per se, but is certainly disillusioned with political parties. And that would be encouraging for democracy. And then finally, it's about policy. It's about, the sorts of policies the country needs, and to have that moderate middle ground, which voters seemingly prefer, given the large proportion of voters that actually veered towards the two moderate parties in the country. We need policy discussions on addressing some of these issues. And I think those are some of the thematic issues that run throughout the chapters in the books that I think need great attention going forward.
I think what Collette is actually saying is it's all very well to say, well, let's get rid of the ANC, but in which case you've got to have some credible alternative. And at the moment, our political parties are failing to offer that. So those parties who wish to oppose the ANC in the forthcoming election seriously have to think of how they can work together, how they can form a credible alternative. And we simply don't have that. Otherwise, as Collette is saying, people are just simply going to opt out of the system.
That was Collette Schulz-Herzenberg and Roger Southall speaking to Creamer Media's Polity about election 2024 South Africa.